Back in mid-July, Creative Assembly announced that they were taking a break from releasing details on Warhammer 3, and since that time we have waited patiently for the next crumb of information that will signify the rebuilding of hype for the game. I was initially confused by the blog post that stated there would be no more news until sometime in September, as it seemed strange to pull the brakes on the hype train and take a 6-week hiatus. Now I think it's quite apparent that part of the reason for the gap was the release of Total War Troy on Steam and the new Mythos DLC. But I think there is another reason for the drought. I believe that Creative Assembly realized that they had gone too early on building of hype for the next installment, and that drawing out that hype continuously for such a long period was going to be very difficult indeed. Another possible explanation is Warhammer 3 will not be ready for prime time as early as they thought, and has slipped back a month or two to later this year, or has been pushed back for a 2022 release. I think it's perhaps too early to tell for certain if this is the case, but we should get a better feel for the release window over the coming month. Whether the break in communication was the right thing to do is up for debate, and I guess we won't really ever know how much it will have harmed the marketing of the game, and if any impact will be seen on sales. Regardless of that, we are now in September, and on the verge of news that will shed light on one of the most anticipated portions of Game 3, Grand Cathay. Creative Assembly stated that this will be the month that the lid will be lifted on the mysterious power in the Far East. Let's hope it's not overcooked. So in today's video, I'm going to go through my thoughts on Grand Cathay, how their roster might shape up, what legendary lords and mechanics we may see, and how the Great Bastion might be represented. For the longest time, the idea of Grand Cathay being added to Total War Warhammer was a bit of a dream, as Creative Assembly had so many races to add across the 3 games, that surely there wouldn't be room for a faction with so little lore sprinkled here and there across the official army books. Well, thankfully Games Workshop and Creative Assembly have decided to take the gamble and add the Eastern power. But how much of the old lore will be used, and will the Grand Cathay that makes it into the game meet the expectations of the community? While I'm hyped about their addition as a core race and their impending reveal, I also find myself concerned that my vision of what Cathay could look like may be way off the mark, and that the race ultimately falls flat for me. To a degree, I feel that this has already happened, as I was not as impressed with the Kislev Reveal as I had hoped. Sure, there were the key elements of bears, oh so many bears, and ice, and the sense of a hardened people from the north, but with no hint of the more mythical side of Kislev lore, such as the Baba Yaga, I felt a bit underwhelmed. But let's stick to Cathay, and set out what my expectations are for their roster. I'm not going to go into specific units too much, though I may mention one or two, but more of how I see the different categories of units shaping up, what I'd imagine would be their strengths and their weaknesses. Starting with the backbone of any army, the infantry. I don't see these as being overly complex. I'd imagine 4 or 5 units along the standard lines. Foot soldiers with spears, foot soldiers with polearms or guandos, perhaps some form of monk warriors, and an elite well-armoured palace guard. I see them as the equivalent of the Empire's melee infantry. Not too powerful, just there to make up the numbers. One addition I think needs to be in the roster from the start though are the Terracotta warriors, controlled by the Wizards of Cathay. I'd love to see them have the ability to raise these units from the ground, much like the Skaven have the Menace below. They wouldn't be the world's best fighters, but their immunity to fear and terror and high leadership could make them a dependable front line. How about missile infantry? Well, once again I'm thinking something along the lines of the Empire, with units of crossbows and gunpowder, but dropping the archers. Now, while the composite bow is used widely in Chinese warfare, to me the most symbolic missile weapon is the crossbow that was used to great effect by the Han Dynasty, and I think seeing crossbowmen as the core missile units is more thematic. I think that a gunpowder unit of some description would also fit nicely, though I'm torn between going the historical route with a version of the early fire lance from the 9th century, or having rifles much like the Dowie and the Empire. I'd also like to see warriors throwing grenades, much like the Dowie miners have their satchel charges. Once again, I'd throw in a unit of terracotta warriors, this time wielding crossbows, and I think it would be quite unique amongst the races to have a missile unit that can be summoned to the battlefield. Moving on to the more mobile aspect of the roster, the cavalry. I don't see this as being a focus for the Cathayan roster. I'd be happy with basic cavalry with sword and shield, and perhaps a heavily armoured shock cavalry with a lance. Then for missile cavalry, I'd just throw in some mounted crossbows. While I like my terracotta warriors, I wouldn't include a version on horseback, but perhaps a terracotta chariot would be more fitting, as an additional mobile unit, allowing for the use of more crossbows. Much like infantry, cavalry would not be Cathay's great strength. So what do I believe should be the focus? 2 words: constructs and artillery, though I guess that's 3 words. I see the constructs coming in a variety of forms, in either onyx or jade. First, there are the onyx temple dogs, your fast movers for chasing down annoying ranged units or harassing enemy skirmishers. Next would be the onyx lion statues, which would be similar power level to the tomb scorpions, filling much the same role as an anti-infantry killer. In line with the lions would be the onyx crowmen, which would give Grand Cathay a much needed aerial threat. They would also be anti-infantry focused. Moving up a tier, we would have the jade constructs. Jade lions would be the onyx lions on steroids, with increased melee attack, magical abilities, and a focus on large targets. These large statues would be devastating on the charge and dependable in combat. I'd go so far as to also make these into a monstrous cavalry option, with palace guard mounted on them, wielding magical weapons, similar in function to the Empire's demigryph knights. The elite of the constructs would be the jade dragons, as tall as the Kemrian war kitty and just as deadly, but with the added ability to fly thanks to the strong magics that power it. This beast would be anti-anything and the centerpiece of the Cathayan army. They could also act as mounts, along with the jade lions for lords and heroes. The artillery would be another great strength for Cathay, with cannons, flame cannons, rocket launchers, which fire a single doom rocket with a large area of effect, and something along the lines of the Hellfire batteries, shooting off multiple rockets at a longer distance, but with a magical twist, where the rockets would burst in the air, raining down magical fire on enemy units. In summary, Cathay would play like a mix between the Tomb Kings and the Empire, fielding strong constructs and artillery behind a line of limited but capable infantry and missile units. It may not be to everyone's taste, but that would do me just fine. Now some of you may be wondering, where are the Monkey Warriors? Well, I don't think we will see the Monkey King at launch, and instead he will be kept for a DLC and bring his legendary warriors with him at that point. Hopefully Monkey will bring his trusty sidekicks too. I'd love to see Pigsy and Sandy with him when that occurs. So if we don't see the Monkey King, who will be the legendary lords at launch? I think the Dragon Emperor is a given, as one of the faction leaders, likely starting in the north of Cathay with a mission to unite the Empire and shore up the defences of the Great Bastion against the coming tide of chaos. I'd imagine he will be a combat-focused lord, and while he may have the ability to use a horse, or perhaps even a jade lion as a mount, I'd love to see his ultimate mount option be a transformation into a great golden dragon. Is that asking too much? I don't think so, though after the execution of the animations for the Coatl in combat, it might prove a bit of a problem. Alongside the Emperor, I'm thinking we may get a brand spanking new character, possibly a wizard of some form, or an interesting take could be a celestial monk, which is geared more toward buffing other units on the battlefield. I know there has been a trend in the past to go for one melee focused lord and one magic focused, but I think Kislev kind of bucked that trend when the new Rasputin wannabe, Konstantin, was revealed. Where would this second legendary lord start their journey? Well, perhaps in the far south of the map, or perhaps off in the mountains of Morn. It's very hard to say, just so long as they have a distinct start away from the Dragon Emperor. One thing I do have concerns over is mechanics. Not so much for Cathay as a whole, as I'm sure Creative Assembly will give them something interesting, possibly tied to the Great Bastion. No, my concern is what mechanics, if any, will individual lords receive. I think with the various DLC that have been released throughout Warhammer 2, that one of the things the community likes to see is unique mechanics for each faction within a race, to help them play differently. I for one find it hard to play lords that have no mechanics of their own, especially if I've recently played another lord from that race that has had mechanics added in their DLC. If you take a look at Tyrion and Neltharion as an example, Tyrion just has access to the standard influence mechanic of the High Elves. Sure, it's useful, but when you compare it to Eltharion's Batcave, it's night and day. I don't want the starting lords for Cathay, or any of the races coming in Warhammer 3, to end up suffering from the same issue as the starting lords from Game 2, and pretty much all the lords from Game 1. Hopefully, Creative Assembly has provided each lord with as much as possible to make them and their campaigns unique. Though, if that's not the case, and unique mechanics have not been added to each starting lord, that gives me more options for mods in Game 3. A silver lining perhaps. Finally, I'd just like to touch on the Great Bastion. I've mentioned previously my concerns over how the Great Bastion might be implemented. Will it live up to its name and its lore? The Bastion is vast, stretching from the mountains of Morn in the west, all the way to the Bay of Cathay in the east. It's an impenetrable wall on a scale that dwarfs anything we have seen in the first two games, and that scale really needs to be represented, both on the campaign map and in the battles. I don't think Creative Assembly can get away with having the Bastion as a single fortress. It's just too large, hundreds of miles across, and that would frankly be stupid. So it would need to be a series of gatehouses or fortresses dotted across the length of the wall. These would act as focal points for the defenders and the attackers on the campaign. To represent the scale, we could have multiple maps, representing different portions of the Bastion. The wall near the Mountains of Morn and the Tower of Ashashare should look nothing like the segment of the wall at the Bay of Cathay, or some random gatehouse. One battle map to represent the wall would be a disappointment, and we need at least 3 or 4. It would also be great to have segments of the wall in disrepair, or perhaps even totally destroyed, as is mentioned in the lore thanks to a series of earthquakes. Fixing these would need to be a focus of the player, and could possibly be a part of some mechanic for Cathay as a whole, where you earn prestige based on the state of the Great Bastion and other important landmarks across the Empire. I've created a video dedicated to this subject before, and if you're interested, a link should be appearing on the screen about now. Well, there you have my thoughts on Grand Cathay and how I'd like to see them implemented in Warhammer 3. What are your thoughts on how Grand Cathay should be featured? What units would you like to see the most? Please take a moment to leave a like or comment, as the engagement will really help the channel, as YouTube will push this video out to more people. If you are not subscribed, then why not consider doing so? I create several new Warhammer videos each week on a variety of topics, so there's a good chance you will find something of interest. As is becoming a regular feature on my Monday videos, it's now time to announce the results for last Wednesday's Guess Who community post. Each Wednesday I post images of characters or units from Warhammer 2 in silhouette, and the community can choose to test their knowledge. Those who figure out who or what the images are get a shout out in the video on the following Monday. So, to the results. The first image was of the Beastman's Bestigor herd. Second, there was the Master Engineer from the Dwarves. And finally, a very tough one, the backpack of a questing knight of Bretonnia. Well done to everyone who got the Bestigor herd and Master Engineer, though it seems the questing knight proved too obscure. Perhaps we all need to play Bretonnia a little bit more. This video was brought to you with the aid of my patrons. Thanks to Hot Apple Pie, Alexander, and Solarith Magnetar. I'm Great Tiger. Thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video.